I had 100% of out late scratch.
Oh,
it's
God.
Just like NBA. Mics are hot. That means I can slander Taylor Heinicke live on the air.
All you want, man. Feel free. That is well worth doing. Well, we're starting
What's up,
with
everybody? Matt Gajewski here with my good friend Terry McBride, and we are a new crew. Normally, we do the Q&A show, at least formerly, on NFL Sunday, but tonight, Saturday night, we have the playoff edition of Live Before Lock, the Showdown edition. You can find me on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. You can find Terry at DigitalB21. Terry, what is up, my friend? How are the first two games going for you thus far?
A little up and down. I'm curious to see where everything lands. I was looking pretty good coming out of the first game. I had some, nice pieces of that. There was a lot of chalk in that game, I felt like, though, too. So I was kind of riding with some of that public chalk. Second game didn't seem to be going as well, but I was deep in the NBA and trying to get ready for this. So kind of lost track of some stuff in there, too. How about you?
Oh, man, it's a great sports day. There's a ton of college basketball on. Obviously, the showdowns for each individual slate. I thought I was looking pretty good heading into the late games as well. And then there's just the fiasco with the Rams. I mean, the Jared Goff playing is in emergencies. Turns out there is an emergency and Jared Goff has to actually play in that game. And thought we were all set rolling into tonight. And turns out that's not true either. Alex Smith, who we were widely expecting to start this game, he's been practicing on a limited basis. He is a surprise inactive. So it's probably the craziest slate of at least playoff football as far as injuries go that I can really ever remember, at least in recent memory. I guess to touch on these injuries first, Tampa Bay, I think it's everything we expected. Mike Evans, he's questionable, but expected to play. Looks like he'll be out there. Carlton Davis, he's one of their lockdown corners. He's also expected to play. The only player who's out of importance to the DFS slate is LaShawn McCoy. We'll probably get basically the same treatment out of Ronald Jones we saw last week. Probably a little bit more run considering it, at least not projected to be a blowout. And then on Washington, the big injuries were Antonio Gibson, Terry McLaurin, both expected to play, and then Alex Smith out. Anything you're particularly watching? I know the Alex Smith news really trumps all else, but what are you making of the injury situations for both teams?
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down on the Washington side of things. I don't pay too much attention worrying about individual defensive matchups, so I don't, typically hit on the corners or, the linemen that are out. I look at it and I read through it, but it's more just a reference point for me. But the skill players on Washington, obviously take a huge hit with Smith going out. I think that impacts pretty much everybody else on the field. McLaurin with the ankle injury and then Gibson with the toe, two injuries that you don't really like to see for guys with that kind of a skill set who rely on cuts and speed and things, of that ilk. But they're going to be out there. So we've kind of got to assume if they're going to be there, they're going full bore, and it's a playoff game. It's a must win quite clearly. So Gibson, I think, is going to have kind of an all-you-can-eat in that bell cow-ish kind of a role that he has. I think, the switch from Smith might take McKissick off the board a little bit more. So I think there's going to be volume for Gibson, and then, whatever kind of passes can connect with McLaurin, I think he's going to get his usual volume, at least in targets. I don't know how close to him they'll actually come, but they'll be throwing him his way.
Yeah, I think the positives we can look to with McLaurin and Gibson, they both played last week, and Gibson, he didn't look quite as effective as McLaurin, and I think the confidence with him just comes from raw volume, like you mentioned. Terry McLaurin, he already saw 8 targets last week, and we were worried about how the Washington football team might use him in his return. It looks like he should be all systems go. I'm not really anticipating anything limiting him outside of maybe just an in-game setback, which we obviously can't predict. But outside of that, I think all of the injuries are pretty straightforward. Taylor Heinicke, he comes in at a very interesting price point. We can start the discussion off with him briefly before we get into the team-by-team deep dive. As far as the quarterback position, on DraftKings specifically, we obviously want to look at some of these guys in captain, and now we get a depressed Taylor Heinicke as far as price goes. He is $9K if you were to captain him. FanDuel is even more egregious. First things first, with the late news, how owned do you think players like Heinicke how Heinicke is going to be owned on each individual site?
So just going by Alex's numbers, the site numbers, it's interesting. On FanDuel, he's not getting the typical ownership that we would see on a quarterback in this situation, which makes sense. I mean, a lot of people don't know who he is, don't know how to pronounce his name, and aren't excited about rostering him. So he's seeing like 7-ish% projection. I expect he'll probably land, maybe in the 10 range when it's all said and done. But we've got him at a higher top scorer probability than that on FanDuel, which makes him interesting. I mean, the price doesn't even matter at 5K. He's basically minimum price over there, and only in the 26% range on flex ownership. So really not drawing a ton of attention and getting a significantly higher score than that in terms of being 2 to 5 scorer. Flipping over to DK, similar kind of story. You mentioned it's 6,000 for a flex spot, 9,000, a little more expensive for the captain spot. But again, a little bit under-owned compared to his probability of being the top scorer in the captain spot, and significantly under in the flex spot. So I think it makes a lot of sense to at least consider in some of these builds. And once you start building in guys like that, and then his less expensive pass catchers, you're getting to basically anything that you want to put into your lineup from the other team. So I think it makes a lot of sense to look at him.
Yeah, I think not only just because people don't know who Taylor Heinicke is, but because of the lateness of this news coming through just, an hour before lock when inactives are released, I think that could depress his ownership a little bit here too. And anytime we see a quarterback at depressed ownership, I at least have some interest overall. But let's get into our team-by-team breakdowns. Before we do so, don't forget to hit that like button. You might as well subscribe to the channel while you're at it. That is the best way to keep up with all our shows, all our DFS offers, flash sales, everything we have going on here. It supports myself, Terry, everyone at Awesemo. So hit the thumbs up button, subscribe. We appreciate it very much, and thank you if you've already done that. Let's start with the Tampa Bay side. I think there's a lot to talk about here just from an abundance of skilled position player standpoint. And everything tonight is going to start with Tom Brady. Now that we have Alex Smith out, not that he was the most owned player on this slate, but he's at least a familiar name to people. Now on DraftKings specifically, we have Tom Brady as not only the highest owned player, but the highest owned captain. And not only that, but he is doubling up the second most owned player. Do you think Tom Brady can pay off the salary? The Washington defense is still a fierce matchup for him.
Yeah, and that's been the concern that I had with Brady kind of in this spot for the full slate and looking at things all week was just, if they get that pressure on him, he's not a mobile guy. It's not like he's going to be scrambling out of there. So he could take some sacks. They could apply some pressure to him, rush some of these passes. That said, it's Tom Brady. He's seen that before. We're not surprising Tom Brady with any defensive schemes, any defensive skill. He's got incredible pass catchers on his side. I don't really sweat it too much. I think, it could be, maybe not an explosive game from Brady, but I think, based on what we've got available to us on the board, could he pay that price off, and could he pay off the ownership that he's drawing? I think so. We see it a lot with the quarterbacks just, really, really pushing it up. On DK, I think there are definitely other guys that you can consider in that spot where we're paying more for the, with the multiplier. On FanDuel, it becomes a little bit more straight line without having to pay for it. And he's looking at, you mentioned doubling up the ownership on FanDuel. He's doubling up basically the probability of being the top scorer on the slate at 30%. When you get into territory like that, that is almost a must captain in a lot of instances. So I can definitely justify that. Now, we talked about it before with Heinicke. You get that leverage on Heinicke where you're getting a lot more top score percentage compared to his ownership there. So it might make sense to maybe captain Heinicke in some spots, but still work Brady in and try and catch a rising tide of all the passing game just going off, and hope that the running backs don't come into play. That could be one way to approach the slate. But I think I would want a lot of Tom Brady here.
Yeah, with all the metrics and everything you mentioned, I think Tom Brady is nearly a must play in every single lineup. The only consideration I'm having really is whether I want to captain him or play him in the flex. And with some of the value opening up, I think it is quite fine just to play Tom Brady in the captain spot, especially in your cash game styles, your smaller field tournaments. It's something I'm going to be looking heavily at. And as far as the matchup goes, I actually think Tom Brady matches up better against the Washington football team than a lot of quarterbacks. He's not a mobile guy. He's not going to get you there whatsoever. So when you play him, I think you want him stacked. But Tom Brady, he ranks 32nd in time to throw. So kind of think about this backwards a little bit. Tom Brady is releasing the ball at such a fast rate that I'm not sure Washington's pressure will be able to affect him like they do maybe a couple other quarterbacks that hold on to the ball a little bit longer. So just an interesting stylistic matchup for Brady. You think the defense is something that we should be worried about here for him?
On the Washington side?
Yeah, as far as the pressure that they could possibly generate on Brady.
Yeah, I think what you just said is a great way to look at it. It hadn't really been something that was, I was thinking of it the other way around, like we started out with, that that could be a danger for him. But the release speed is really interesting. That's a cool way to look at that, and something to think about. So yeah, with that in mind, I think maybe we don't sweat the D quite so much in terms of the pass rush. And I think, in terms of the secondary, I think it's Tom Brady, and we don't really worry about the individual coverage, particularly with the receivers that he's got on his side. So, yeah, I now that you're saying that only makes me want to play Brady more. So, can we go higher than 100%?
Can we? I would like to. Can we play him in the captain and the flex? I mean, I'm trying to if possible. But
you're talking.
Like you mentioned, I mean, if you're considered about the individual matchups for any one player, Tom Brady has so many weapons that I don't think a lot of them are going to matter. With Chris Godwin, Mike Evans seems like he's healthy enough to play. I was happy that he notched a limited practice, so he's not coming off just straight a week of DNPs. He actually got on the practice field and was able to move around a little bit. Throw in Antonio Brown and Rob Gronkowski, you have a litany of weapons to stack with Tom Brady. And I think I'm probably going to be trying to get at least two of these guys. Rob Gronkowski stands out to me as someone I'm going to have a lot of just from a price perspective. On DraftKings, if you just want to look at in the flex spot, Rob Gronkowski at 5,800 is kind of an avenue to get some of the other studs and maybe a double stack with someone like Godwin or Evans in this lineup. How are you approaching the pass catchers? They've been very difficult to decipher on a weekly basis this year.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an embarrassment of riches, especially since Brown came to the team, since Antonio Brown joined them. They've been distributing that ball all around in kind of unpredictable fashion. So in terms of targets, who's going to be getting them? A little bit tough to guess. I mean, we've seen in recent weeks, we saw a couple, week 16, Evans got 12 targets. Antonio Brown had 6. Next week, it was 4 targets for Evans. I mean, they're up and down the board. The most consistently stable guy is kind of Godwin. He's just always in that 7, 9, 10 is like the high end range. So you at least kind of know what you're getting there. It's a little less volatile than the other guys. But there's so much upside in an Antonio Brown. And if people aren't necessarily going to be on one of these guys, that's kind of where I want to go. It's not necessarily Brown, but as compared to Godwin, it would be Brown just in terms of ownership, in terms of price. So I kind of like getting to him as my favorite wideout, but I agree with you on Gronk. Gronk is a favorite target of Brady. He's somebody that we know these guys know how to throw and catch the ball to one another and do it in the playoffs. So little narrative in there. But I mean, Gronk has been involved in the passing game. He's been scoring touchdowns. So I like getting to Gronk. I was trying to press him up a little bit in my standard slate ownership, and I would be doing the same here. And if we can do it with some savings built in, then yeah, I think it makes a heck of a lot of sense. And at 5,800, that's exactly what you're getting from Gronk on DK. And then just trying to find him here. 10,000 on FanDuel makes him a little bit more, he puts him in that tier alongside of a little bit under Antonio Brown. But you're talking about with all the value there, if you're building Heinicke in, you're going to have that money to spend. So it's a matter of, am I leaving 5,000 on the table or 7,000 on the table? Maybe not exactly, but, essentially. So he makes for an interesting play. I think it's more interesting on DK where there's a pretty decent salary savings.
I agree 100%. I like him a ton on DK. I was also really interested in him on the main slate. And I think people will maybe shy away from Gronk if they're box score hunting a little bit. You'll see just 2 and 4 targets in his last 2 games, but those were both pretty significant blowouts. If you guys remember going back 2 weeks, they played Detroit. They finished that game 47-7. Go to last week. It's a closer game against Atlanta, but it still finished 44-27. So we're talking 2 pretty significant margins of victory for this team. Not exactly the game script where you need to be throwing targets out there to Gronk. So I think you can still look to him as a little bit of a bounce back. As far as the other pass catchers go, Godwin is someone I'm interested in just because he's so steady. He has the highest target share when healthy this year. Mike Evans, I think, will be the most contrarian, obviously because of the injury. And he's shown up at least down the stretch prior to the 4-target game where he exited in the first quarter with an injury, 7 and 12 targets in back-to-back games. The only real caution point I have here, if you're looking at raw targets for someone like Antonio Brown, 14 targets in the most recent game. If you guys watch this Tom Brady's literally just throwing him shuffle passes at the end of that game because he had I believe it was a $250,000 bonus if he reached a certain reception threshold, which Brady ended up just giving him because of those. Yeah. I mean, 14 targets looks amazing, but then you see Antonio Brown just literally catching shuffle passes at the end of the game. So I don't know. I think my favorite is tentatively Godwin, but what do you make of that? Do you have a favorite?
Yeah, like I was getting into, and you just touched on, again, Godwin is getting the most reliable target share. I was, high on Brown. I just think he's he's dynamic, and they were going to him a little bit. So he was a guy that was on my radar. Evans with that big target share, I can really get into any of these guys. So really, it's a matter of how they fit. And with the pricing the way it is on DK, I like Brown at 9,200. I think he's still popping a little bit for me. He fits into the lineups, and you can again do anything that you want with salary once you start building on some of these sites. On FanDuel, where Evans is 14.5 compared to Antonio Brown's 11.5 and Godwin's 12.5, I would zero in more on Godwin and Brown over there and kind of leave Evans in that really heavy price tag off to the side a little bit more. It seems like the public's kind of doing that, though. And on an ownership leverage look, it might make sense to pay up for Evans and kind of try and build a little bit of a contrarian lineup that way.
I like that. I like the contrarian approach. Yeah. I have a game theory question for you approaching these pass catchers. I think they're probably going to come in a little under-owned just given the fact that there's so many of them. They're going to, of course, project a little bit worse than Brady in the captain slot. Brady, deservedly so, should be the most owned captain. But if you're trying to take a contrarian approach to this slate, and maybe it is Chris Godwin or Antonio Brown that just reels in 3 touchdown receptions, and there's not enough yardage for another pass catcher here. Do you have any interest in that sort of contrarian build overall? Not necessarily isolating one of the pass catchers, but are you willing to get to any of them in the captain spot?
Yeah, I think we can definitely do that. We've seen on FanDuel a couple times this year. We've seen that come through where the wideout has just been one focused wideout who scored multiple touchdowns and exceeded the quarterback because he's just going to that one guy. Nobody else was really racking up. So the wideout's able to get ahead. So I definitely think we can do that. Just looking at the board by top scorer percentage, most of these guys you're talking about all in the 5-ish, 5, 6, 7 range of probability of being the top scorer. So once you get into that, you're definitely walking that line of, like you said, it's game theory. You're walking that line of trying to be contrarian. They're all coming in around even Gibson. I'm sorry, that's Antonio Gibson. I'm trying to sort these without the teams. So Brown is coming in just about level. Evans is coming in, and Godwin's coming in a little bit over-owned in that capacity. So you're taking a risk if you do it with Godwin, and you're coming in around the field. So if you do it, I would want to kind of leverage up and do it a lot rather than only do it a little to get it. So if you're doing that and you're putting Evans in, all right, I want to have it more than the 3.1% of the field. You don't have to go nuts with it, but I would want to have that 15% of the time. Grab a lot of it if you're going to do it that way, so that you can kind of leverage up on the field if it does connect. Otherwise, if you're doing it and you're only riding it in 2 or 3 lineups, you're still not very different than the field. So it's a spot where I would really want to try and get ahead of the field on one of those guys if I was to do it.
And I think that does make a lot of sense. I think you'll have to get contrarian on this slate in some fashion, just because we're seeing so much of the ownership isolate around Tom Brady. And since we've gotten the Taylor Heinicke news, the line in this game has swung drastically in Tampa Bay's favor, as you all are expecting. It's now sitting with the Buccaneers -10, give or take, depending on your sports book. The total is now 44.5 points. With the total swingingly so wild in Tampa Bay's favor, I do have some interest in the run game here. Of course, you are going to have to determine the direct split between Ronald Jones and Leonard Fournette. I think from an optimistic perspective, we can look to the blowout that Tampa Bay played in last week and think perhaps Ronald Jones' workload was a little bit depressed with the 12 carries. It wasn't all that long ago that Leonard Fournette was a healthy scratch. They've used him in an interesting way this year, kind of as a pass catching back, which isn't typically the mold of rusher he is. But now we have LaShawn McCoy out, so Leonard Fournette is certainly going to be active. How do you see the backfield touch breakdown shaking out?
This was one of my least favorite backfields of the year. So it's one that I just don't like to try and predict. But I think it's been in Jones' favor all along, all week long. So there's no reason to really change my opinion on that now. So I'm going to lean Jones heavy. And Fournette is a player that's frustrated me pretty much anytime I ever go to him. He's let me down, and then he has his big games in other spots. I agree with you. It's interesting that they've gone to him a little bit more as a pass catcher, which on DK, if you're collecting the full PPR points, could be a little bit interesting, a little bit more so than on FanDuel. So maybe a little bit more in play for me as a flex play over on DK than he would be on FanDuel. But that said, I think my focus would be more on the Jones side of things.
I agree with you there. I think Ronald Jones is honestly underpriced if we're assuming he goes back to his role. So prior to the 12 carry game we saw in their most recent contest, Ronald Jones had a pair of absences. He was placed on the COVID list. He had a hand injury. But prior to that, 19 touches, 18 of which were carries. One was a target. That was the game where Leonard Fournette was a healthy scratch. So I still do think they displayed enough faith in Ronald Jones to use him in this capacity. And as a 10-point favorite, I know the matchup is tough, but you're getting literally a guy with a ton of scoring equity here. And I think one of the few contrarian spots that I have some confidence in on this particular slate. From an ownership perspective on DraftKings, we're talking just about 7% in the captain slot, which is something I'm more than willing to take a shot on. Do you feel the same way?
Yeah, definitely. And that compares pretty favorably to the number that we're seeing as far as being the probability of being the top scorer. Like you said, if they get out ahead, there's a good chance they're just going to burn off the clock and start feeding these back the ball, keep it on the ground, and he can rack up some additional yards. It might even trend toward, hey, the Bucs put up some points. Washington's been totally inept on offense, so it might even trend toward a lower scoring game than where you're even expecting. And just feeding the backs the ball, and you're only just worried about racking up the additional yardage and not even worried about who's getting in the end zone with so few points on the board. So with an unpredictable kind of a game script, yeah, I have no problem going to some of these running backs.
With some condensed ownership, mainly coming in on Brady again, do you think perhaps playing Leonard Fournette and Ronald Jones in the same lineup could be a contrarian approach worth targeting tonight now that they're 10-point favorites?
I like to do weird things like that, and it's something I've been meaning to kind of explore in lineup study or something on FC, and just kind of dig into on how those pay off, and I just haven't had a chance to do it. But I do sometimes like doing that because it's something that people shy away from a lot. And anytime there's something that as a philosophy people shy away from, but there's not necessarily numbers that we know behind it, and it makes some sense from a role, from a volume perspective, and of course from a price and a leverage perspective, then yeah, I can get into doing it. I was doing that a little bit after the news with Alex Smith coming out. I had a pretty decent share of in standard format of Smith with McKissick because I like his volume in the passing game. And when that changed, I didn't necessarily go away from McKissick, but I started building a few lineups in my replacements that had both Gibson and McKissick because I figured they've got to give these backs the ball, pretty decent amount. So on that side of this game in Showdown, I would definitely be looking to do that with that team. And I think, yeah, it probably makes a lot of sense to do it with this team as well if we're just expecting it to revert to a ground game in the second half.
I agree. And one of the main factors I look for when I'm considering rostering two backs on the same team, what is their price? And today, looking at DraftKings specifically for a moment, you get Ronald Jones priced down a little bit at 7,200. Leonard Fournette himself is at 4,600. So they're not even priced as if they would be in a 50-50 timeshare, which I think you're not spending a ton of salary. You can still jam some studs around them. I think there's a lot of ways to potentially take this. Again, it is probably served just for your large field tournaments, but a strategy I think is certainly in play. Before we pivot away from this Tampa Bay team, I do want to ask you about some deep dart throws. A lot of people in here are going to be playing the massive tournaments tonight. And I think with the condensed offense on Tampa Bay, it is a little bit difficult to get to some of these ancillary plays. I think there's two avenues we could see this game going where we get to a few of them. One is Tampa Bay playing a lot of 12 personnel, so using two tight ends on the field at the same time. We've seen this from Tampa Bay at different points in the year, primarily before Antonio Brown had served that suspension. We saw them use a lot of double tight end. With Mike Evans coming off the field last week, we saw Rob Gronkowski play 45 snaps. We saw Cameron Brate play 34. So while I don't think Cameron Brate is going to be massively involved in this offense, I think there is a chance he maybe sees a slight uptick in snaps and routes run just with Mike Evans coming into this game banged up. Is there anyone, Brate included, that you'd be looking at as just a pure dart throw in large field tournaments?
Yeah, it would probably be Brate for me. He's the guy with the most somewhat, if I had to just snatch a touchdown out of the air, that's a weird way to put it when I'm talking about catching a touchdown pass, but that would be the guy that, yeah, I think that he's going to be on the field for a decent amount of volume regardless. We'll see him get some snaps. The the Evans thing definitely plays into it. If we see Evans come off the field, I never like predicting the injury front of it, but even if he's 80%, if it leads to a few more snaps and maybe 1-2 extra red zone snaps, that could be the difference for Cameron Brate. And in a large field tournament, that's exactly the kind of play that you're looking for. A guy that we know does catch touchdowns and does get some target and some volume. So give me some Brate there. On this side of this game, I think that would probably be it. I'm just taking a peek down. Yeah, I think that would really be the play. I mean, there's just not much in terms of any of these probabilities on just Alex's top stacks tool here. So give me Brate. Maybe as a flex play, if you wanted to throw a Scotty Miller in there, is getting 2.3% ownership compared to 0.4% of being in the top 2 to 5. But I guess if we're talking about pure GPP total dart throws, I guess how many snaps is he going to get? Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't think many snaps. If we want to just look at what happened last week when Evans exited the game, we saw Scotty Miller play 28 snaps, but Tyler Johnson also played 18. So I don't think there's any confidence that Scotty Miller would be the guy receiving all of that work. And then Mike Evans is active tonight. So even if he plays a decoy role, he still has to be on the field to do that. That's going to take someone else off the field. And it's not going to be a different position. It's going to be someone like Scotty Miller, another wide receiver. So unless Evans aggravates the injury, I don't really see a path to a lot of snaps for him. Unlike Cameron Brate has specific packages where he's on the field just because of the tight end position he plays. They use double tight end, 12 personnel on a decent number of their snaps, making Brate, I think, the most confident pure dart throw for me. I mean, we're talking sub 2K in the flex spot on DraftKings. So Brate, unowned, very cheap. I don't feel great about him, but I mean, if you're looking for pure value, guys, we're not going to get a ton of them on this particular slate. Any last words for Tampa Bay before we pivot over to Washington?
Just in terms of the Brate play, it's also interesting on FanDuel. He's 7,000, which kind of puts him in that range. We're talking about, Cam Sims is 9,000, Lenny Fournette's 9,000. So it's not a dramatic difference from them to him. So that just might be a spot where people aren't going to make that change and put Brate in instead of one of those guys who's maybe a little bit more projected and, maybe coming up in optimizers. So it's probably an anti-optimizer kind of a play. So I think that makes a little sense. It's just a mix-in option. I wouldn't be rostering him at captain, but if you want to throw him into some flex spots, I think it makes some sense.
Yeah, I'm definitely not condoning the Cameron Brate captain, but it's a dart throw flex, perhaps. Guys, let me tell you about Awesemo Plus. Terry and I are referencing all sorts of tools. We're referencing the ownership, of course. We're referencing the probabilities these players have of being the top scorer on the evening. You can get all of this with Awesemo Plus. And with the new year, you can celebrate 2021 by getting 21 days of Awesemo Plus for only $20 when you use the promo code 2021 at checkout. This gives you access to everything Awesemo Plus has to offer, including player projections, lineup builder, and much more. And there's more than that. If you love Awesemo and you're looking to commit to a longer term, we're giving 20% off an Awesemo Plus yearly platinum pass with promo code HAPPY. That's HAPPY. This will be our only discount for the yearly pass, so don't miss it. Again, all of the Awesemo Plus tools Terry and I are referencing, they can all be found there. Alex Baker creates them himself. He uses them. It's a special you do not want to miss. Terry, heading over to the Washington side of things, we have a little bit of a mess with this news. My first question before we get into the individual plays, how do you think Taylor Heinicke's insertion into this offense affects how they play?
I think they're probably going to be feeding the ball to the backs a little bit more than I was expecting. I think, they would be dinking and dunking around the field regardless. But that's, Alex Smith is really good at that. I don't know that Heinicke is going to be able to execute much of the game plan that they would have wanted to play. He did get a lot of practice reps in, so I guess he is kind of baked into what they're going to be doing, but it's going to limit their offense, I think, outside of standard run plays and basic passing packages. So I think there's an argument for, I always like to, when we're going to backup quarterbacks, look for those safety valve kind of a players as far as the skill players go. So I think there's an argument to bump Logan Thomas up. I think there's an argument still for JD McKissick, who is very involved in the passing game out of the backfield. So I think there's going to be, a lot of that going on. We talked about it earlier with McLaurin. I mentioned it. I think he's still going to definitely get a lot of targets. I don't know that it's going to be as reliable that he's going to be catching a lot of those or putting up a big game. So I think maybe a ding to McLaurin and maybe a bump to some of those other guys.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I tried to do some digging on Taylor Heinicke this week in preparation. And he's a guy we really don't have any sort of sample on. I mean, this year he entered a game for Washington. He threw 19 passes, completed 12 of them. He is by no means a dual threat quarterback. He actually has a somewhat efficient 55 yards on 9 carries in his career, but going back to his time in college, not a dual threat whatsoever. He started a game back in 2018 for Atlanta and actually threw the ball 53 times. He completed just north of 60% of those, but he only finished with 274 yards, a touchdown, and 3 interceptions. So we're very much talking about a fringe NFL talent with Taylor Heinicke. I think the positives regarding him, lower ownership, he's still touching the ball in every single play. And now you're getting him in a spot with a depressed price on both sides, making him pretty hard to fade. We already talked about him at length at the beginning, so I want to talk some more game theory with Heinicke. What are the chances you put him in the captain slot? What is the likelihood he is the top scorer on the week? And is this a strategy you're willing to take?
Yes, definitely a strategy I'm willing to take. I like it more the larger the field gets in, large GPPs. If I was building one entry, it actually might be the way I go. Who's building one entry just because I'm a contrarian GPP player, but I don't know that it's safe. So it depends. If you're looking to build one lineup that has a shot at the top, but is most likely going to not even cash, then go with Heinicke at your captain spot. If you're a little bit more risk averse and you're looking to cash that one lineup, play it safe. Go with a Tom Brady, somebody like that, and try and get different elsewhere. But yeah, I think for our large field GPP players, people mass entering, I think that it makes a lot of sense to dedicate a swath of your lineups to Heinicke today. You're only seeing 5%, 6% ownership at the captain spot over on DK, and compares favorably to his probability of being the top scorer. And then we mentioned it earlier, doubling up his captain ownership on FanDuel in terms of as far as being the top scorer. So definitely over there at 5,000, I think you bake him into the captain spot a decent amount of the time. If he's going to be at that 7%, even if he's at 20 or 10 rather, I don't mind being at 20 on him if I was doing that and building a full slate of lineups.
Right. How much Taylor Heinicke do you really need to play to get over the field tonight? And based on the projections on Awesemo, it does not seem like a significant number. And if you're playing him in the captain slot, you're already kind of off on an island by yourself. So you can sort of run more of a chalky build, I would say, depending on the field size of your tournament. But there's definitely concerns for Heinicke. We love the volume here, but Tampa Bay, they're still a top 7 yards per pass attempt defense as far as what they're allowing to opposing signal callers. They're getting Carlton Davis back tonight, one of their top perimeter corners on the season. He missed the last 2 games with an injury. So it is not all sunshine and roses for Heinicke. But again, like you mentioned, the price, the volume, they're pretty much lining up where I'm going to be playing him at least in the flex spot in a lot of these lineups, which means I'm probably going to be stacking him. And that brings us over to the pass catchers on Washington. We know Terry McLaurin is at least not 100%. Based on what we saw last week, I still think he's healthy enough to target, but now we're talking about paying an elevated price for him. What are your thoughts on Terry McLaurin heading into this slate? I mean, at 8,800 in the flex on DraftKings, I think he's more than affordable, but again, you're talking about a little bit of opportunity cost between McLaurin and maybe some of the Tampa Bay pass catchers.
Yeah, and that's really where you get down to it. He's far and away the highest priced receiver on this team. Compares reasonably with most of the receivers on Tampa Bay in terms of price, except for Godwin, who's a little bit elevated on DK. And then flipping over to FanDuel, he's decently more expensive than Brown, less expensive than Evans. So he kind of slots in there. So if you go to him, you're going to be probably sacrificing one of those high upside Tampa receivers, and you're going to have to thread your needle a little bit finer. Whereas if you go to one of these other guys, you're going to have all the money to spend again in the world that you need. So I can definitely see the argument for going to them. As far as from a talent perspective, though, is 80% of McLaurin still better than any of these other pass catchers by far? I think that's pretty fair to say. He's been excellent. The volume, not really overwhelming for any of these other guys where I want to predict where the ball's even going. I think it would be Cam Sims from a wideout perspective. And then I mentioned Thomas before as a pass catcher. I think definitely gets a boost in what's going to be going on with this offense. So he's been a primary target all along for them. I think if anybody gets a bump from McLaurin being damaged, it would probably be him.
Who do you think the wide receiver 2 is? I tentatively want to lean Logan Thomas at this point, even though he plays that tight end position.
I can totally endorse that. I'm with you.
Yeah. So, I mean, you get Logan Thomas here at 6.6K on DraftKings. At first glance for a tight end, you're like, okay, well, he's more than Rob Gronkowski. How much do I really want to roster Logan Thomas? But at the same time, I think we want to stack Heinicke. And if you're not paying for McLaurin, I do think he is the second safest option. We're talking about raw targets for Logan Thomas. He's had at least 6 targets in each of his last 5 games. And there were 2 games in that span where he received 15 and 12 targets. That was his third and his second most recent game. So while the target volume is certainly not going to be efficient, I think the touchdown likelihood for him is pretty low. You're still dealing with a lot of just raw PPR points for that reason. Do you kind of view Thomas the same way, or are you more willing to just punt down with a guy like Cam Sims or Steven Sims?
Yeah, so I would definitely, in a full build of 150, be getting to some of both of the Simses. Cam would probably be my preference out of the 2. But if I was building one lineup or picking which of these guys would be my favorite choice out of that group, it's Thomas with a bullet. I mean, there's no doubt about it. So I think he makes a ton of sense to be, as you said, considered as the wide receiver 2, definitely the pass catcher 2 in this offense, no doubt about it. And if we take a look, he's over-owned in terms of being the captain on DK, where you're paying $9,900 to captain him, and you're only getting 1.8% probability of being the top scorer, and he's still going at 4.6% captain ownership. So that doesn't really make a ton of sense. But getting to him where he's only 26% owned in the flex, we've got him at 14% of 2 to 6 probability in some of these. I feel like on volume and on what we expect from this offense now, maybe that climbs a little bit now that we know it's not going to be Smith, and maybe Heinicke is going to rely on the safety valve a little bit more. And, I think he makes some sense to be considered a little bit more toward even than maybe the numbers are showing on DK right now, as of my last update anyway. So I think it's him with a bullet as far as out of those guys, and basically all of that holds up across as I click over to FanDuel. So he would definitely be very involved. But if I'm building GPP lines, definitely from a leverage point of view, you're talking about Cam Sims on FanDuel, 12.4% of being in the top 2 to 5. You buy a little bit of leverage with him. He's only around 10% flex owned. So I can make the argument there if you wanted to switch that up, get a little savings, get a little ownership leverage. It's not a massive difference though. So, out of however many 100,000 lineups are going to be in the tournament, is nobody going to be building that? Probably. You're still going to be matching somebody. Are fewer people going to be building that, which is basically all we can hope for in some of these? Yeah, I think fewer people would be building that route. So for a GPP consideration, yeah, I can get some of the Simses.
I think so too. Just one little note on this game. We do have Antonio Gandy Golden inactive. He's mixed in as that third pass catcher at times this year. I think his absence just kind of solidifies Steven Sims in that role. He's still going to be a part-time player. He won't be on the field as much as someone like Cam Sims or Terry McLaurin, but I think it does put him in play a little more than some of the other ancillary pass catchers that we'll have on the slate. Pivoting over to the run game, similar to the Tampa Bay side, we have 2 rushers that are fairly active. Antonio Gibson, someone dealing with turf toe. It still looked like it was hindering him a little bit this past week when he made his return, but he still saw a large workload. He practiced on a limited basis this week. I think just the more we're removed from that turf toe, the more confidence we can have in him. But at the same time, we're talking about a Washington football team that is entering this contest as a 10-point underdog. And that obviously lends itself to the skill set of J.D. McKissic as a pass catcher. Is there one you prefer out of these 2?
Yeah, my preference all along was McKissic. I was trying to get to him. I thought he made a heck of a lot of sense. A couple days ago, I wrote him up in a article that I do based on the Boom Bust tool. Tomorrow's will be up sometime after this show once I get a chance to breathe and write it. So yeah, give me. I was getting to a fair share of McKissic. I've got a fair share of them in the standard slate. So I would be looking to continue that trend and not try and hedge my bets there by going to Gibson too much. I think he's still going to be involved in the passing game. He makes a lot of sense. He's a guy who sees heavy volume there. So like I've been saying, I like to get to guys who are kind of safety valves when it's a backup quarterback, an inexperienced quarterback. And that's going to be exactly what he is. So yeah, give me McKissic there. I have no issues going to the other side of it, of course. I think there's plenty of argument to be made for Gibson. I think there's an argument to be made for going to both of them as well, like we talked about before.
I like that call a lot just because they're running backs that are used in different ways. But at the same time, like we want to look at McKissic's target volume. I mean, the dude's targets are ridiculous. We're talking about 9, 8, and 5 targets in the last 3 games, Antonio Gibson carried 19 times in their last game, very inefficient on those carries, but he only had 1 target. So when we're talking about a Washington football team that's a 10-point underdog, I also think I'm more likely to get to McKissic at a cheaper price. And I actually think he could be a contrarian stacking option with Heinicke, just given the fact that he's had a large target share. We're not exactly confident in Heinicke's ability to push the ball down the field. So this could be just an interesting kind of rack up the PBR points and move on with JD McKissic. And interestingly, with Antonio Gibson, I keep isolating DraftKings, but Antonio Gibson, he comes in more expensive on this particular slate than Ronald Jones, which is a bit egregious to me. In that instance, I'm just going to pivot to Ronald Jones outside of my most contrarian lineups. Do you view this the same way?
Yeah, that sounds like reputational pricing almost. Just, that people think Gibson's so much better, but not considering the role, the opportunities, and what they've done, in recent times. So I agree with that. Give me, if I was making that call between those guys, give me the savings on Ronald Jones. That makes a ton of sense. And yeah, Gibson's gonna have a role. They're gonna feed him the ball, especially if they're in the game. I think it actually makes more sense that he's going to see some touches rather than, if they're playing behind, they're going to need to throw the ball. We expect them to be playing from behind. I also think that once you get into talking about how the game's going to flow and what's going to be happening actually on the field, we're looking for a big play. We're looking for a touchdown, somebody who's going to catch coming out of the backfield. I think you get more opportunity toward that with a guy who's going to be a pass catcher, a guy who I essentially considered as you said it before, with the tight end being the wide receiver 2. McKissic's probably the wide receiver 3. He got, I think he had 120 targets this year and like 80 catches. I'm remembering those numbers from the other day. So he was all over the place. So a guy who can catch the ball out of the backfield and maybe break one at lower ownership at a much lower salary. Yeah, give me that guy all day.
And like you mentioned, it's not like we're talking about significant ownership for McKissic. Right now, he's coming in sub 30% in the utility. I don't have a ton of interest in captaining him, but he is drawing 5% captain if you do want to play him in that spot. And I guess we can answer that question as well. Do you have any interest in any of the Washington running backs? We have seen some of these slates just get flipped like crazy. Like the Jets got a couple wins, one being on prime time. So crazy things do happen. You could get a little bit weird and roster one of these guys in captain, but to be honest with you, I don't think I have a lot of interest.
Yeah, I think it's more straightforward than that. And considering for GPP play, of course, we want to get some shares of different captains and try and be a little bit different. But I think there are, some safe, sensible plays in this one to kind of make where you can put those guys reliably in the captain spot and then get different elsewhere. So I don't think we really want to get too wacky. Yeah, we can see the football team defense and captain win somebody $100K tonight. It could happen, sure. It's not very likely to happen. And we're kind of playing toward the likelihoods on this slate, I think. We've got to consider different constructions, different combinations of picks, but we don't want to just be totally wacky and say, well, that guy's not owned at all, 0.1% ownership, so that's my captain. That's not how you get different with this. It's about the different combinations.
It's funny you mentioned that. My next question to you is going to be the same thing we talked about with Tampa Bay. Who are the potential dart throws? We're talking just large field tournaments, probably not guys you're ever considering in the captain slot, but just your complete dart throws that people need to know for their flexes if they're playing these large field tournaments. I think outside of Steven Sims, there's probably not a ton.
Yeah, I think it would probably be Sims would be the answer. He's the most logical guy to get those targets. And then, even I'm just looking at the where some of the balls have gone recently in the passing game.
Yeah, I mean, like Peyton Barber's fallen in the end zone at times.
Right. And Peyton Barber was, I think, in one of my 150 lineups for the standard GPP, just as a total dart throw and a max salary lineup. Just looking at I was just saying, Isaiah Wright, if he's even active, might see the field for 2 or 3 snaps, but has gotten 1, 2, and 1 and 0 targets the last 4 weeks. I just don't think anybody else is really going to be involved to any kind of significant degree on the side of the field.
I'm with you on that. But we need to talk about kicker and defense. They're not the sexiest positions, of course, but I think even in the context of Showdown, they become increasingly important. And given the fact that we have a decreasing total, we have an increasing spread, it certainly is setting up to be a low-scoring game environment. And now, I mean, people at first were interested in playing the Washington defense. Now it looks like it flipped a little bit. People are more interested in playing Tampa Bay's defense. In the context of this slate, are you willing to get to either of the defenses here? Kind of talk me through your approach with defense overall.
Yeah, I would consider some defense. So I play more on FanDuel where that doesn't really come into the equation. So I'm kind of spitballing here a little bit. But, for 3K, if you're building in some football team defense and thinking about that, maybe Tom Brady holds on to the ball a little bit longer than normal, and you're talking about a difference of a split second. So if that can happen and they can get to him a couple times, maybe pick one off, maybe they put up a little bit of a score, but you're really not riding a tremendous amount of probability again here. We're talking about 7.4% of being in the 2 to 6 finishers of total points on DK. So while I don't love it, as definitely on the GPP side of things, it can be built into some lineups. I would be getting to it probably around where the field is at 13%, maybe a little bit less. On the Tampa Bay side of things, they get a little bit more interesting in terms of being the top one of the top plays from a scoring perspective. 27% probability of being in the 2 to 6, and going under that in terms of util ownership. So maybe it makes some sense, and I think a lot of people will be going there just because we know we're getting a backup QB. We know we're probably going to get a just total garbage offense, and there will be some opportunities to have some floaters and maybe take one to the house for a pick 6. So that makes a lot of sense that they would be the more owned team. But if I was making a choice, if somebody said I had to roster one of these, I would probably lean toward the lower owned football team and take that upside and take that salary savings as well.
For sure. We're just talking about one of the most variant positions in football. It doesn't even necessarily have to come on, a pick 6 or a sack, strip, fumble. Like, so special teams count too. They return a kick, boom, there's 6 points for your defense. So I think including at least a little bit of both of them makes some sense. And especially in the context of a low game environment, you get Tampa Bay, who's a pass heavy team. So Washington's going to have opportunities to rush the passer. Conversely, for Tampa Bay, theoretically, they're the team playing from ahead. That's going to lead to pass rushing opportunities for their defense as well. What about kickers? So we have Ryan Suckup coming in with slightly more ownership for the Tampa Bay side. We have Dustin Hopkins for Washington. Talk me through your kicker approach. I assume you're probably treating both of these guys similar. I don't particularly see a difference between them as far as just a slight price difference, and one of them's favored. But how are you approaching kickers?
Yeah, I pretty much take kickers as I get them if I'm crunching out 150 lineups or more for a full slate of GPP entries. They never really excite me. It's not something I really go out of my way to roster most of the time. Suck up, decent amount of a decent level of probability of being involved and being not necessary maybe, but 15-ish% chance of being in the top 2 to 6 scores puts him on the board at least. But he's getting ownership. People are aware of that. So. It's on the board. It's there. It's never something I'm really, really looking to do. But in GPP play, like I said, I can get there. So yeah, they're playable. They're decent kickers. Suckup clearly the better kicker. I'm just looking at some kicker stats as I'm talking. 90% this year as compared to Hopkins was 80-ish%. So yeah, I can probably lean into the Suckup side of things more. Hopkins looking at it, 13 kicked from 40 to 49. So if we're talking about a little bit of distance and really getting into it, then maybe a little bit more leg there, but more reliability on the Suckup side of things. That's my kicker take.
I love the kicker takes. That's what everyone's here for, man. But it's a single game format. We got to talk about these guys at least in some capacity. Before we close out the slate, guys, thank you all for being here. Hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. The best way to support us at Awesemo, and we love bringing you the content. So if you've already done this, thank you very much. We appreciate it greatly. Let's close out with a little roster construction talk. So I think the most popular construction overall is going to be some combination of Tom Brady at the captain spot, stacked probably with 1 or 2 pass catchers. I think people will greatly gravitate between the Godwin and Antonio Browns, maybe hesitant with Mike Evans because of the injury. But if you roster those 3 players, you're already working with a limited salary. So how are you particularly approaching this slate? What are you doing with the captain and finding ways to get different?
So I think the primary way to get different, if you're willing to take some risk, is probably putting Heinicke in that, as uncomfortable as it might be, in that captain spot. You're going to be putting a foot on a path that is wildly different than a large portion of the field. You're taking a risk. And again, it doesn't have to be a massive amount of your lineups, but you can buy some leverage over the entire field by starting with a Heinicke quarterback and a Heinicke captain, and then building in maybe two of his pass catchers. Or looking at it differently, build in a Heinicke and one pass catcher, and then get a couple of the skill players from the Tampa side. I don't have the pricing combinations in front of me. We're talking about some expense, so you would probably have to drop down and maybe work in like a Lenny Fournette. If you're building in with Heinicke at captain and Lenny Fournette in a flex spot, you're going to be pretty different than a lot of people out there. And then whatever you can afford to build in from the more chalky pass catchers, I think maybe makes some sense. It's not a safe play, but it's a way to get different, and it's a way to potentially approach a GPP.
I love that approach. I think even if you just fade a captain Tom Brady and you maybe stack one of his pass catchers, not only is that going to afford you a little bit of extra salary to work with, but you're also just fading a captain Tom Brady who is approaching 20% in the captain slot. And I honestly wouldn't be surprised if that comes in a little bit higher as people just, yes. I mean, the panic sets in with Taylor Heinicke being the late addition. People don't know who he is. Maybe they're a little less interested in Washington. So perhaps Tom Brady comes in with a little bit elevated ownership. Are you leaving a lot of salary on the board tonight as a way to get contrarian?
Yeah, that's something in Showdown and single game slates that I think is a valuable approach. You don't want to get too crazy with it. Alex and I talked about that at one point during the season, and it makes total sense. You want to do it in an intelligent way, and a way to do that is by following a game script. What is the most likely path that this game is going to take? So we talked about going to the ground game. So I think maybe following a game script like that makes some sense, and that kind of naturally leads, just the way the slate is priced, to leaving a fair amount of money on the table. So if you're building in with some of those options that trend toward a lower scoring slate, some of the running backs, maybe the tight ends, you're going to start getting toward that build where, all right, now I can leave 2,000 on the table, still have a high upside lineup, still have a fairly safe floor kind of a lineup if you're taking a smaller slate approach or a single build approach. So yeah, I think it makes sense to do it that way. If you're building a passing game attack, it's more difficult to do, but I think it still makes sense. So maybe we grab one of the lower owned guys that we talked about, the dart throw type guys, and do it that way. You don't want to get too dart throwy though if you're going to do that and leave money on the table. So it's a fine line to walk there. But yeah, I think leaving money on the table is a good way to get different.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to do this. I like doing that in the methods you mentioned. I think those are great ways to approach this. I think you can also kind of flip the build around a little bit. Tonight specifically, I think you're probably going to see lopsided builds in favor of Tampa Bay. I think we're going to be looking at a lot of 5-1s, a lot of 4-2 constructions. I honestly think this chalk build I have right now is going to be very owned. It is a Tom Brady captain, double stacked with Antonio Brown and Gronk. Running back Ronald Jones fits in there. And then for the Washington side, it ends up with Heinicke and McKissick with just 200 left on the table. I think that will probably be close to the chalk construction, give or take maybe a play or two here. But do you think we could potentially load up on a Washington slide? Not exactly a Washington onslaught, but maybe a 4-2 construction in their favor just because it's going to be largely unowned?
Yeah, it's a good thought. Definitely going to be a super low-owned approach to the slate. And maybe if we're doing that, maybe we do take both running backs in that spot. So you take both backs, take a pass catcher, and take the quarterback. And then that should leave you a little bit of salary to spend on the other side. So maybe, and I'm not looking at it, but maybe you can get Brady in the flex and one of his cheaper pass catchers. I'm not building it, so I'm not 100% sure about that. Maybe if you follow that narrative, maybe you go to a Ronald Jones or even a Lenny Fournette and the kicker, and approach it that way and just say, hey, if I'm fading Tom Brady in the captain spot, I'm going to take Tom Brady completely off the board and not sweat that passing game and take their passing game off the board. Maybe that's a totally different approach to go. So we're talking about wildly contrarian ideas for what this game is going to look like. The most likely thing that's going to happen is the Bucs are going to blow the doors off when Tom Brady is going to be the best captain play. So you want to get different, but those are ways to do it.
Is that mainly what you're doing? Just going with the Tom Brady at captain and then, stacking some pass catchers, maybe a Ronald Jones and then Heinicke and a pass catcher for Washington. Is that mainly how you're building?
Yeah, that's, I think, the most sensible way to do it. So I like to get different. I would work a fair amount of different plays in there and take some of the captaincy that I talked about, primarily around Heinicke, maybe around some of those pass catchers from the Tampa side, and try and capture some different lineups that way. It's just so difficult to get different with anything chalky at the captain spot that it makes the most sense to go to the highest likelihood play in that spot for me, which again is Brady.
Yeah, I love Brady tonight. I think Brady I never want to use the word lock, but Brady, maybe not in the captain spot, but he is going to be in a vast majority of my lineups tonight. That is very safe to say. But guys, we are approaching lock right now. Before we head out of here, just want to highlight a couple things we have going on at Awesemo. Some things changing a little bit for the playoffs coming up. Tomorrow, we still have all of our pregame stuff. It is a 3-hour stream. It kicks off at 10 a.m. Eastern time. That, I believe, Terry, it's you and I again. We're doing the strategy show. Is that correct?
Yep. It's us again. It's us on the short turnaround tonight. So
yeah, Terry and I are running it back. We are kicking off the DFS show tomorrow, the 3-hour show. Behind us, you'll get Laffy, Alex, and Ben doing their deeper dive. After that, you, of course, will get Spags. He will take you into lock with the Live Before Lock show. But of course, thank you guys for all watching tonight. Hit the thumbs up button, subscribe on your way out. Again, I am your host, Matt Gajewski. You can follow me on Twitter at Matt_Gajewski. He is Terry McBride at DigitalB21 on Twitter. Thank you guys for watching. Good luck tonight, and we will catch you again tomorrow.
That was fun.
Yeah, man.
It always gets interesting. I always sweat when we come one game to talk about with an hour to fill, but it goes by, man. It's good.
It